Take a person, take a story, take you on a journey. It's your take.
On today's Your Take, I'm joined by a British journalist who is the son of a Labour Party politician who was a member of the European Parliament. My guest started his journalistic career in 1991 and went on to write the popular weekly column, Beta Mail. In 2008, he used the column to advertise his wish to gain practice in public speaking. He received over 400 responses and went on to speak publicly at a training day in Bath, a Rotary club, a women's group, a church sermon, and a prison. My guest writes features for The Times and has interviewed a number of high-profile guests. These include Tony Blair, David Cameron, Paul McCartney, Kate Winslet, Liam Gallagher, John Terry, and many more. Today I talked to journalist Robert Crampton. We discussed Robert's childhood and his education, his path to becoming a journalist, his proudest moments, and his life away from the newspaper world. Thank you, Robert, for joining us on this momentous Sunday evening.
Yeah, well, we're all in a good mood, aren't we?
We are, and obviously we know what the front pages of the newspapers will be tomorrow. That aside, I'm looking forward to talking in detail about your career and the many things you've achieved over the course of it. But I will say, to begin with, you're the second journalist we have spoken to.
Oh, yeah.
John Aizlewood was the other guest.
Oh, I've heard of it. I don't know John, but I've heard of him. Doesn't he write? He used to write for The Observer, or maybe he still does.
Yeah, specialises mainly in sport and music. Yeah. And also a television broadcaster as well. We're going to start off by going back, Robert, to the very beginnings, and we'll turn the clock back to 1964 as we head to the north in Blackpool, England.
Crikey, yeah.
I wanted to ask, what are your memories of your childhood, and can you recall your time living in different parts of the UK, including Solihull and the city of Hull as well?
I can just about recall Solihull. I cannot recall anything about Blackpool for the excellent reasons that I stayed there for 3 weeks after I was born. That was a pure convenience. My mum and dad had just been in Africa for a couple of years, and they came home principally. It was the end of their tour, their assignment. They were teachers in Uganda. And they came home basically to have me, and it was either go to where my dad was from in Blackpool or go to where my mum was from in London, and they chose Blackpool. And then my dad got a new job in Solihull, and I can just about remember Solihull. I was there till I was 6. I've got vague memories of it, but nothing. I mean, you don't remember that much, do you, from that age, or you sort of remember things that you've been told, and so maybe you don't really remember them. But yeah, I remember Hull, obviously. Lived in the suburbs of Hull, where I went to school between the ages of 6 and 18, in a kind of suburban comprehensive, which by Hull standards was pretty good. By national standards was probably pretty average. And then when I'd finished at school in 1982, my parents then moved into the centre of Hull, where I lived for a little while until I went to university. So my mum and dad are dead now, but when I used to go back to Hull when they were alive, up until 6 years ago, it would be to the centre of Hull that I went. And but I still recall a lot about it, not least because I still go up there a lot, because my wife's also from Hull. We were at school together, and her parents are still alive, and one of her brothers still lives in the area. So we're up there a lot. In fact, we're going up there in a couple of weeks. So so that idea that a lot of people I know, they sort of left their hometown, as it were, when they were 18. They went to university and they never really much went back. That's not the case with me. I've been go back a great deal, so the memories are kind of kept fresh.
Shortly, we're going to come on to your education and talk in some depth about it. But Firstly, I wanted to talk about your parents. And
Mhm.
your father, Peter Crampton, was a teacher and geography lecturer and later became a Labour politician and a member
Yeah.
of the European Parliament.
Mhm.
And your mother was a geography teacher,
Mhm.
and you also had an older brother, David.
That's right. Yeah.
Can you describe your relationship with your parents and your brother, and what
Oh,
life was like, growing up in the Crampton household?
it was. I mean, the primary thing about our household, as you hinted, was that it was very, very political. Even when my parents were still teachers, as they were until teachers stroke lecturers until the mid-80s, they were very involved with the Labour Party and with CND and anti-apartheid and a whole number of left-wing causes. I remember going to the Rock Against, I mean, I sort of by default, I got to see the Clash and the Jam, not because I was a particularly massive music fan or particularly fashionable or trendy, but because I went to Rock Against Racism gigs. So I'd sit there in the audience, but we were so political, I'd be waiting for sort of Tony Benn to come on and speak, thinking, when's the Clash going to shut up so I can hear Tony Benn? And that was at the age of sort of 14 in 1978. But of course, now I can claim a certain amount of cred because I saw all those bands. Then, although not for slightly complicated reasons. So it was primarily political. It wasn't just our family, it was the extended family. My mum's family had been deeply involved with the British Communist Party. That was like both my grandparents on her side were members of that. Both my aunts were, and several of my cousins. And on my dad's side, although they were sort of Labour people, left-wing people, and so that very much kind of dominated my childhood, although possibly that was down to me as well, because I don't think it dominated my brother's childhood in the same way. He was a different kind of personality. He was in a way more conventional, more normal. He just sort of got on doing what kids did in the 70s, which was sort of, going to football matches or making model aeroplanes or seeing his friends or that kind of thing. Whereas from a fairly early age, I was quite involved in politics. I remember going megaphoning in the 1974 general election. I was 10. It was ridiculous. I mean, there's this sort of shrill, prepubescent 10-year-old telling people how to vote in a megaphone. But that's the way it was. I guess I was more interested in it than he was, and more extrovert. And that is my kind of memory of it. It was a happy family. I mean, it wasn't particularly in the culture of the times. I mean, you're obviously a lot younger than me, James, and maybe this didn't apply in your family, and it doesn't apply in my family now, nor in most of my friends' family. But then, parents and kids you were fairly, especially up north, you were fairly kind of physically undemonstrative. My dad was a classic kind of northern man in many ways. He was ahead of his time in some ways, but in terms of being emotionally fairly not repressed, but emotionally fairly undemonstrative, I guess he was like that. My mother was more demonstrative in all sorts of ways. But it was fine. I mean, we had, by the standards of the time, we were fairly well off. I mean, they were both teachers, so we weren't rich, but we weren't poor. And crucially, they had moved from the Midlands to the north, so that meant, in terms of property prices, meant that we lived in a decent house, because they'd have the advantage of that disparity between being able to sell a house in Solihull, which is a kind of nice suburb of Birmingham, and then moving into a nice suburb of Hull. It was a lot cheaper. So we lived in a decent sized house on the edge of the country, and we had the odd foreign holiday, and it was pretty comfortable compared to most of the kids I was at school with. I think, although they were in the same sort of very well-off suburb, most of them, their parents they wouldn't have had necessarily a middle-class kind of professional job in the way that mine did. So, go on.
Shortly, I want to come on to your time at secondary school and then going on to further education and your tenure at university. But I wanted to pick up on your political activity and associations with your family from a young age. And would it be fair to say that because of your parents, particularly your father's political beliefs and persuasions, do you think that was instilled in you? And do you think you carried on those beliefs even to this very day?
Yeah, I know, although I'd probably, in sort of policy terms, I would probably be to the right of my parents on some issues, because the other influences come into play, like growing up in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher, for instance, and they'd grown up, they'd grown up in the 50s really, but then probably been influenced by the 60s. But yes, I mean, broadly speaking, no, hugely influenced. I mean, and in a good way, because I mean, like, just say, I mentioned anti-apartheid. Well, I mean, they were right, weren't they? You know, they were right. And we were on the right side of history. But I remember going on marches where there were only sort of 50 people on a march protesting about apartheid or racism in this country, or the beginnings of, I mean, I remember my mum, because they were geography teachers, I remember them talking to me about global warming in the early 70s. They were onto that very early on, but they were very minority tastes at the time. I mean, now I write leaders for the Times occasionally, and I write leaders about really, which would be sort of fairly radical leaders about, because we're quite radical about the environment and conservation and so on, and the endangered species and that kind of thing. But then they would have been considered sort of way out hippie eccentricities. So similarly with gay rights, I mean, I said my father was a typical northern man, but on that issue, he never had any problem with gay men and women. Never had any problem with people of a different color. His brother, my uncle, was married to a Nigerian, so I had 4 mixed race cousins, which was unusual at the time. So yeah, it was a huge influence on me. A lot of it now would seem very tame and very mainstream, but it wasn't at the time. And that's a legacy that I've got to say I'm quite proud of. Yeah. On other issues, as I say, I probably would have ended up to the right of my parents. I mean, if they were alive now, I wondered what my parents would be saying about the war in Ukraine. I think they would be a little bit more pro-Russia than I'd be comfortable with, whereas I'm very much not. You know, because they'd be saying NATO had maybe had some part in provoking the Russian action, which I don't agree with. But I get, I'm going to put words in their mouth, but I think that's probably what they would have said. They were very opposed to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. They were, you know, I wasn't. But I mean, well, again, they were probably right about that. But there would have been other things. They would have probably been Corbyn supporters, I think. My mum died just before Corbyn got elected, but she would undoubtedly have supported him. My surviving aunt, who I see occasionally, she did support Corbyn, and I thought Corbyn was a disaster for the Labour Party. So I mean, if that's moving to the right, then yeah, I'll probably move to the right on certain issues of policy. But on the main issues, or most of the main issues, like most of us, it's a myth that children rebel against their parents. I mean, most of us actually end up believing pretty much what our parents believe. So yeah, it was a big influence, and not my beliefs, but also the level of my interest in politics and current affairs was also hugely influenced by that, because I grew up. It was a huge advantage to me, really, because now as a journalist, although I'm not a political journalist, I end up writing sort of tangentially about politics quite often. And I just find that knowledge is kind of there, you know, that stuff that maybe other people would have to look up or wouldn't have to hand. It's there in a way that some people would have the knowledge of I don't know, science or any, you know, whatever their mum and dad did, you know, they would know about the health service, or they would know about different, you know, the oil business or different countries or whatever. You know, there's a sort of knowledge that you just kind of soak up from your parents, depending on their job. Or, you know, I mean, my wife's in property, and our kids will probably grow up knowing stuff about, not a lot about the property market. Do you know what I mean? Just because osmosis. So yeah, big and massive influence. Yeah.
Next, we move on to an early chapter in your life, and you went to a local comprehensive school called Wolfreton.
That's right.
What are your memories from your time there, and what subjects did you find interesting? And did you have any early career ambitions?
I'll get on to, my memories of the time there is more complicated, so I'll answer that last. But in terms of career ambitions, I always had a vague idea that I wanted to be a writer, professional writer. I suppose at that stage, being fairly naive, I would have probably thought that meant writing books, because that's the sort of writing that I was exposed to. Because I suppose when you're 11 or 12, you may be starting to read books. You're not necessarily starting to read newspapers. But it didn't go beyond that. I didn't have some great plan. The subjects I enjoyed, obviously I enjoyed English and history and the sort of social sciences and the arts. And then I quite enjoyed maths until I was about 14, and then I sort of parted company with it. I think at some point we all, unless you're a genius, we all kind of part company with maths, or physics, because it's hard. And mine came at about 14. My wife, she went on till about 16, as did our daughter. But a cousin of mine who did maths at Imperial College and was a bit of a genius. Even he said when he got to his third year, he was starting to struggle with it, even at an incredibly advanced level, because it's just really, it's designed that way. It just gets really difficult. So yeah, I mean, predictably enough, for a journalist, I like to write anything where I could write and opine, and yeah, they would, and that's in the arts and the social sciences, and the stuff where it actually, I mean, I've got a great respect for people who do science and maths and engineering and medicine, because it actually, you have to actually know what you're doing. It has to be, there's a right and a wrong answer. Do you know what I mean? Whereas the rest of us, it's often just a matter of opinion. Yeah. It's why medics and engineers and scientists work really hard at university, because there's a certain amount of stuff they just got to know. Otherwise the patient dies or the bridge falls down, Whereas if you're going to be a journalist, you're learning different skills, but you're not necessarily learning a body of information. We know journalists, the classic journalist skill set is to know a little about a lot. Yeah. And I would say, so our knowledge is pretty shallow, but pretty wide. And that's me to a T, really. I could talk about almost any subject with no great expertise whatsoever.
Interestingly, after leaving school, you went on to retake your A-level exams before going on to university.
Yeah.
You studied at Wadham College in Oxford.
Yeah.
What did you study at Oxford, and what did you learn from your time there?
I did
and sorry, and second to that, can you also talk about, after graduation, going on to study journalism at City University in London?
Yeah, although I didn't answer your initial question, about my memories of school, which kind of plays into the fact that I left school. I stayed till 18. I actually left at 17 because I became quite unsettled and unsettling at school. I didn't like it beyond the age of about 14, and rebellious, I suppose I became, and eventually I left halfway through the sixth form, which is hence the necessity to retake my A-levels some years later. But when I did retake my A-levels at the local FE college in Hull, for which I'm very, very eternally grateful to that institution, I then studied politics, philosophy and economics at Oxford, the classic PPE bullshitters charter. Beloved of, although Boris Johnson is a rare one, because he actually did classics, but it's the classic. I think Blair did law, didn't he?
Yeah, he was. Yeah, Blair was law. Yeah.
Yeah, but Cameron did PPE, and I think Osborne did PPE, and William Hague did PPE, and half of the shadow cabinet, and it was And I was there with a lot, and Cameron was there when I was there, as was Michael Gove. Boris Johnson had just left. He's the same age as me, but because I went a bit late, he'd already left. And I think the Miliband brothers were there, and all those people who ended up running Britain, although my generation is now getting a little bit old to be running Britain. But there was a period for the last 10 years when that generation of people who I've been at college with, not that I knew all of them, but I knew some of them, were in charge. So yeah, I did PPE, and it was fine, but it was felt very much, even though I was already 21, 22 by the time I went, I still felt slightly out of place there. Partly because I was out of place. I mean, it's not much better now, but then the idea of a state school northerner was still fairly rare, certainly outside of the sciences. And so the people that I probably would have had more in common with were sitting away, hunkered down in labs or going to their lectures, the sort of grammar school boys and girls, if you like, from the north, or from Bristol or Bath or whatever. Whereas the people who were doing kind of student journalism and student politics and stuff that I was interested in, they all, almost to a man and woman, tended to have attended Southern public schools. So I did feel a little bit uncomfortable there, although it helped being a bit older. That gave me a kind of cachet, which wasn't entirely deserved, but it meant that the average 18-year-old public school Southerner thought I was a sort of slightly glamorous and mysterious figure. I mean, it's all very silly now because we're all so much older, but there was a bit of that there. But primarily, if I'm honest, it was a bit of, I think we all feel this a little bit about university. You just sort of work out what you're doing there, and then it's sort of time to leave, and I probably didn't enjoy it or make as much of it as I should have done, but I think that's pretty common experience. But to me, it really was a means to an end, because in terms of getting started, I met people there who, I said I was pretty woolly about how I was going to make a career as a writer, but I met people there who were anything but woolly. Their parents had been or were journalists, and they knew that they were, that was the way that if you want to be a professional writer, that's the way that kind of 90% of people make a living as a professional writer. They don't make it by sitting in an attic writing the great novel, because either it doesn't get finished or nobody buys it. So that really was a very good education in journalism as much as it was in anything else. And also, again, Britain being the sort of country it is, it's about who you know, not what you know. And I met people at Oxford who are now still, some of whom are still my friends, many of whom are very senior in the media, and they were, so a couple of them were quite instrumental in not so much getting me jobs, but basically telling me the ropes. This is what you do. You get some shifts students can get shifts on the London's Diary or the Evening Standard, or you can get a vacation job, which I did got a vacation shifts on the Sunday Express, which was still in Fleet Street at the time. I caught the very tail end of Fleet Street. And I did a thing called the Daily Telegraph Student Extra, which kind of hired students principally from Oxford and Cambridge, because they were the ones who knew about it. I mean, this is the way the British establishment works. It's not necessarily a conspiracy. It's just they go to what they know, so it all just replicates itself. And occasionally people like me are allowed in, because we've got ability, and also just because we're there, and so therefore it gets renewed. But it's essentially the same thing of people. That's why those two universities are so influential. Hopefully less so now, and less so in other subjects, in other fields of, there's I think certainly in the maths and sciences, there's as much cachet in going to Imperial or going to maybe parts of Manchester or whatever, but broadly speaking, it's still a big deal. And that is how I think I would hope that I would have broken into journalism, national journalism anyway. but I certainly had a bit of a shortcut to it because I'd been to Oxford.
Mm.
No question about that.
Interestingly, at the beginning of our conversation, you said from your early schooling years, you had a love of words and English, and writing was something you always aspired to.
Yeah.
But why specifically did you want to pursue a career in journalism? And initially, which area of journalism did you want to work in?
Well, I suppose I just didn't. When it came to it, I thought I would have had, when I was young, when I was very much younger, I would have had a kind of romantic notions about what I described: sitting in an attic, writing a great book, or going in, sitting in a cafe in Paris like George Orwell or Ernest Hemingway or something, and writing a great novel. But when it came to it, I just wasn't. I wasn't that sort of person. I wanted a structure. I wanted to. I liked the idea of it, and I still do, and it's one of the reasons that I haven't written a book, but other than the collected columns. I think I've got a short attention span. I like the fact, or I admire people who can sit and devote a year of their life to one subject, but I don't think I can. I'm interested in. I mean, the charitable way would be saying it would be to say I'm interested in too many things. The uncharitable way of saying it would be I lack the concentration span to do that. And so when it came time to choose, and I was looking at, I was 24, graduating, looking to get on. It was a natural fit for me, journalism, just because I like, and it still is. I just like the rhythm of it. I like it being something that you do either in a day or maybe at most a week or so, and then it's done. It's behind you, and you move on to the next thing. To answer your other part of your question, I suppose when I was that age, because I'd just done a politics degree and because of my family background, I would naturally have thought that I would be a political journalist, which is why I went to work for the New Statesman. I applied for a bursary from the New Statesman at that time. Offered a bursary to two people to go and study part-time to do the postgrad journalism course at City University, whilst also working on the magazine, and that's what I did. So to talk about, I'd feel a bit of a fraud talking about City University because I was barely there. I mean, I did a bit there. I was there for a term, and I went to a few lessons in classes in the second and third term. But principally, I was doing stuff I was already a working journalist. I was doing stuff for the New Statesman, and so whenever there was a conflict between going to a class about journalism or actually doing the journalism, I chose to do the journalism. So that's how I mean, I am an alumni of City University, as are many of my colleagues, but I didn't really have much exposure to it, because I was just.
Before we talk about joining the Times newspaper back in 1991, I wanted to ask you, when you first entered the journalistic world, what was it like at the time? And can you tell us about some of the interesting stories you covered?
I graduated in 1989, and like you say, I got on the Times in 91. So I only had 2 years of my career, although in a way my career started whilst I was still at Oxford, because I was devoting more energy to doing journalism for whoever I could get to publish stuff than I was to my studies. But only 2 years of my kind of official career have not been spent at the Times. And that was the New Statesman, and then briefly the Guardian, briefly a newspaper which you may not have heard of called the Sunday Correspondent, which went bust after about a year. Briefly Robert Maxwell's newspaper, the European, and whilst doing shifts and freelance stuff for the Telegraph and a tiny bit for the Mirror as well. What it was like then was it was the fag end of the glory days of Fleet Street. The Times had already moved out to Wapping in 1987. There was a few papers. The Daily Telegraph had gone to Docklands. A few papers were still in Fleet Street. It was incredibly antiquated. They were still on typewriters. You would write up your copy and put it in a cylindrical tube, and it would go up via a like a hydraulic system to
Yeah,
wherever it went to.
yeah.
I mean, it was Dickensian. It was extraordinary.
It almost seems like a scene from sort of Terry Gilliam's
Yeah.
Brazil. Yeah.
Yeah. It was Dickensian. I mean, it was 1989. It was probably much closer to 1889 than it was to where we are now.
Sure.
I'm the first day at the Telegraph, I was given an ashtray, and they gave me an ashtray and a mug. Still very male. Everyone went to the pub, at 11 o'clock. That whole sort of drinking culture, fiddle your expenses, do the minimum. That was all still in situ, but it was more or less, it was sort of declining. It was changing, but I caught the end of that. That's completely gone now. That's completely changed. But it was it was fun, but it wasn't really a full-time job, to be honest. Everything was printed still on site. And when the presses started, the building shook. It was very much, you felt part of an industrial process.
And was it still heavily unionized back in that period?
Yeah, I mean, it was. I mean, Rupert Murdoch, who I should be nice about because he's basically been paying me for the last 31 years. And I would be nice about him because I think he's done a lot to preserve journalism in Britain. Certainly the Times, because for most of its history under his ownership, the Times has lost money. It now makes a profit. But for most of that time, he was essentially subsidizing the Times because he likes newspapers. And obviously he likes the power and the kudos that they bring, but he likes the romance of newspapers. So, the unions, it was a bit tragic, really. You'd go down to where the printing presses had been, and there'd be some guys with a photocopier. They still had a degree of power and a degree of. There was a demarcation between the journalist and the printer. There'd be a line on the floor over which the journalist was not allowed to cross. But the guy on the other side wouldn't be operating a printing press; he'd be operating a photocopier. So that was right on the cusp of that change. Most of my career has been spent on the other side of that change, there was still that culture that still, I think, some people of a certain age still associate with journalism, but that basically, and that persists, the sort of drinking, seat of your pants kind of stuff, that sort of went on for a while, probably into the 90s, and then it gradually stopped. And it stopped partly because once the internet came along, our business became much more competitive because newspapers were and are competing with products that are free. And so we all had to work harder. The labour force was cut. I mean, there were the stories I've heard from the long before my time where there'd be people on the Sunday Times magazine who would be required to write 3 or 4 articles a year, because they had the staff, they had the money. Sunday Times made a shed load of money, and then that gradually changed. But even when I was starting out as a feature writer on the Times magazine, there'll be some years where I might only write 20 pieces in a year. There'd be long pieces, but it wasn't, like I say, it wasn't a particularly onerous job. Last year I wrote 250 pieces, some of them were quite short, but it's changed, and that whole sort of boozy, mucking about, get pissed at lunchtime culture just doesn't exist anymore.
Can we move on and talk about your time at the Times newspaper, which started back in 1991?
That's right.
Can I ask you how that opportunity came about?
Well,
what's it been like to work for the paper for over 30 years now?
The opportunity came about, like so many things in life, it was quite accidental. A friend of a friend was going on holiday. This was October 91, and she asked me. She was a fairly junior editor on one of the feature sections of the Times. I think it was called Weekend Times. It's now called Weekend Times again. I think it was then. The title changes, but it's now called what it was 30 years ago, which is sort of lifestyle feature section of the paper on a Saturday. And she said, "Can you cover my couple of weeks?" And I did, and they liked me. And then somebody was going off to have a baby, and so there was a 3-month, she was only gone off for 3 months, maternity leave to cover. So I did that, and they still liked me. And then I started doing a bit of writing. That was editing. And then they gave me a contract as a sort of half and half writer and commissioning editor. And that sort of worked for a while. And then they realized I wasn't really very good at, they liked what I wrote, and they realized I wasn't particularly good as a commissioning editor. I was pretty hopeless because I never wanted to, I always wanted to write it myself, you know, so I was no good at really giving people direction as to how to, you know, set things up or what we wanted from the piece. So within about the space of a year, a couple of years, by 93, I was a full-time feature writer, principally for the Saturday magazine, and then served my kind of time there doing and did some reporting and some foreign stuff, and covered people for columns when they were on holiday and that sort of thing. Finally got my own column in 2001. In terms of how it's been great. I mean, I don't know whether people tend to have two images of the Times. One is that one I think is now changing. It's all sort of very posh people in kind of bowler hats. You know, it's the establishment newspaper. That wasn't true even when I started. It was much more male, and it was probably more public school than it is now. But it wasn't even then. It didn't feel like a sort of old school establishment paper. Not many newspapers do, because newspapers are inherently anti-establishment. You know, we're there to
hold them to account, I guess.
Hold them to account, and just sometimes just to make fun of them. You know, I always describe it, we're the kids at the back of the class. You know, there's the sensible kids at the front of the class. You know, and they turn into lawyers and doctors and accountants, and that's all fine, but we're the ones mucking about at the back. Yeah, and that is essentially what journalism is, and I don't make any apology for that, because I think somebody's got to do it. It's in a free society, you know, and it fits my personality and the personality of the people that I work with, that we do that, which is why they are fun places to work, you know, because you've got a whole load of people who are looking to make a bit of trouble and have a laugh, and don't take themselves too seriously. Certainly in British journalism. I mean, American journalism is incredibly serious, you know, it's really, and that's a good thing. But when you meet American journalists, it's like meeting lawyers here. They take it all very seriously, and we don't really. And the Times is no exception to that. The other myth about the Times is that because of the shocking public image of Rupert Murdoch, is that it must be a very cutthroat, profit-driven, unpleasant place to work, and it's just not. I mean, it's the worst places I've worked were the New Statesman and the Guardian, which are both, you know, left-wing institutions, in terms of the working conditions and how people treated you. I mean, that's maybe because I was very junior at the time, but the Times, as always, even when I was very junior, I was always a really, I suppose it was kind of paternalistic, but in a good way. You never been driven, never overworked, never bullied, never, you know, shouted at, never asked to do something that you weren't comfortable with. Never told, you never told what to write. I mean, you might have a good sense in your own mind of what you shouldn't write, in terms of there be a degree of self-censorship, but you're not told, this is our line on this, you must write it. You know, people often ask me, you know, are you told what to write in your column? And I've written over 1,000 of them, of the beta male columns, and no, I'm not. You know, they just, you know, they think, well, they like this guy. You know, they think we like this guy. The readers seem to like him, so let him crack on. Yeah, that's the way it's been. And I mean, when we were in Wapping, it wasn't such a great environment because it wasn't a purpose-built office, and it was all a bit pokey, and Wapping's not a particularly nice area anyway. But since we've moved into London Bridge, where we've been for the last 8 years, we've got, it's a nice office, nice working conditions. I like going in there. Some people work from home, but I could work from home, but I choose not to. I like being there, and I like my colleagues. And it helps, I think, that I've worked principally on features rather than news. I mean, I think hard news, it can get a little bit macho and a bit more shouty, partly because their deadlines are much more pressing, and partly because they're all men. Whereas features tend to be women. I've always worked for my immediate bosses on features. I've always been women, they still are, and that suits me down to the ground.
Shortly, I want to talk about the column you've been writing for many years, Beta Mail, which you briefly mentioned, and also venture into the world of public speaking, which I kind of share some common knowledge on, and I'm interested to pick up on that. But first of all, I wanted to ask you something about the psychology of the journalist, because you've mentioned about the culture, the way things worked and how they've changed quite radically. And you've mentioned about kind of your role as journalists is to scrutinize or tackle the establishment, their failings and incompetence or whatever.
Yeah.
Obviously, the press have been scrutinized over their, particularly the tabloid press, over their behavior, intrusion of people's private and public personas. As a journalist, how do you feel when you pick up on a story, perhaps a scandal, perhaps someone doing something beyond the law, which could ruin their reputations, it could ruin their lives? How do you feel? Because at the end of the day, you're human beings, and I wanted to hear kind of your perception of, because people are quick enough to say, why are journalists writing these things? Why are they maybe telling lies? Why are they destroying people's livelihoods? But I wanted to hear it for the perception of,
well, there's lots of issues.
There's
lots of issues there. I mean, first of all, in terms of what happened a few years ago with the phone hacking scandal, particularly with what happened with Millie Dowler, the schoolgirl who was kidnapped and murdered, 13-year-old, and it turned out that some tabloid journalists were hacking into her mobile phone. That was obviously a complete scandal, and should not and could not be tolerated. And that's the reason that the company that I work for, News Corporation, shut down the News of the World. So that was an outrage. And everybody I know on the paper thought the same. And it was principally the tabloids, but that sort of behavior probably had seeped into some broadsheets as well. And there would have been things that nobody done, that nobody was very proud of, that would not happen now. I do think we cleaned up our act. In terms of finding stuff out about people that might ruin their lives, I think my own measure is, how powerful are they? How much did they bring this on themselves? How old are they? If you find out I mean, I've interviewed an awful lot of youngsters because I've interviewed a lot of people in music and acting and sport, and often by definition, especially in sport, they're young, they're really young. And I remember interviewing Peaches Geldof, may she rest in peace, when she was 17, and she said some fairly idiotic things in the course of the interview, which I didn't put in the paper because she was 17, and I thought that wasn't fair. If somebody had said similar things to me when they were 35 or 45 or whatever, I probably would have put them in the paper. I mean, I'm not the sort of journalist who is uncovering political scandal or financial scandal, but the people who are, I think I'd salute them, and I don't think they should have any qualms at all about bringing that stuff into the public realm. whatever effect it has on the people that they're writing about. I mean, one of our best journalists is a guy called Andrew Norfolk, who's uncovered all the child sex abuse stuff in Rotherham and Rochdale and elsewhere. Now, I suppose at some point, Andrew could have considered the feelings of the men who he was exposing, but nobody in their right mind would think that he should have then sat on that information. It had to be brought into the public knowledge, brought into the public realm, because the safety of other people was more important. I'm much more, what I've done is much more at the level of sort of celebrity stuff. And then I've tended to, again, I go a lot by youth. I think if somebody's a 21-year-old footballer, they didn't set out to be famous necessarily. They set out to be a footballer, and they're not necessarily particularly well-informed or particularly articulate. So if they say something, I would give them the benefit of the doubt. Yeah, I wouldn't just put something in the paper just make them look stupid because it was a good quote. Yeah, but if a 41-year-old manager said something like that, something equivalent or something controversial, or then yeah, it goes straight in. Of course it does. That's the object of the exercise. You're there to find out about somebody. I remember, I'll give you an example. I interviewed the magician Derren Brown many years ago, and this was before Derren came out as gay. And in the course of the interview, he said a number of things, and the penny just dropped with me. I thought, this guy's gay. I didn't make it, I obviously didn't make a judgment about it, but I just thought this guy, I said, Derren, and we were getting on. And so I felt able to say to him, Derren, are you, and we've been talking about relationships and blah, blah, blah. And I said, Derren, are you gay? And he said, yeah, but please don't put it in the paper because I haven't told my mum. And I said, fine, I won't, because I thought, I don't care who he sleeps with, but, and it doesn't really add anything. And I don't think it's if he doesn't want it known, then it's not any of our readers' business. Yeah. Although probably as a pure journalist, as a pure reporter, that was information that I'd received and I could have put that in the newspaper. But I know when he said, oh no, I haven't told my mum yet, I think you've got to be human about it, and say, yeah, of course. Well, that's your call. And then a few years later, he came out as gay, and he didn't give me the first interview, which I was pissed off about.
Can I move on now and ask you how the idea for the weekly column Beta Male came about, and when was the column first published, and why do you think it's become so popular?
It was first published in September 2001, so it'll be 21 years old soon.
Oh, wow, long time.
It came about because my then editor, a woman called Jill Morgan, a good friend of mine, what happened was that the phrase alpha male, which is now kind of part of the language, wasn't then. It was but it was starting to be used. People were talking about alpha males in politics, and the kind of the tough, the sort of. I mean, I think there was a phrase that had been used in science for a lot of the time, but it hadn't really crossed over into public, everyday public use. And it was, but by then, sort of late 90s, early 2000s, it was being used a lot. And she just had the brilliant idea of saying, well, never mind about alpha males, what about beta males? Yeah. And she liked the phrase. And she asked me to do it because I'd done a few, when my predecessor, John Diamond, suddenly died very young of cancer, I'd been doing the column in that slot. When he'd been ill or on holiday, I'd deputised for him. So she knew that I could sort of make it work. And the reason it works is because it's timeless humour. It's about men cocking things up, and you think about humour down the ages, male incompetence and the difference between male ambition and male reality is a source of an awful lot of comedy. Yeah. And meanwhile, the women stand there rolling their eyes and being competent and sorting everything out. And that is the nature of a lot of marriages. It's certainly the nature of my marriage. So I was well suited to write it because I wasn't a classic alpha male. I wasn't a classic beta male either, in that I you know, got quite firm opinions and all the rest of it. But I didn't mind making a fool of myself, I suppose. And I knew I could make it funny. And the reason it's survived, I don't know, because the people like it and my editors like it. I mean, I'm amazed that it's gone on for nearly 21 years. And I like writing it, I suppose. I still like writing it. A lot of columnists, I think, get fed up. They run out of material. And I haven't done that yet, touch wood. I've sort of, and it's been a sort of journey. I mean, I suppose people are in, you know, like a soap opera kind of thing. People identify with the characters in it. I mean, my kids, when I started writing it, my kids were 2 and 4, and they're now 25 and 23. So it's been a sort of journey of in that respect. But mostly, I think it doesn't take itself, the classic British self-deprecating humour, isn't it? You know, that we don't take ourselves too seriously. And, or if we do, if we sort of, we pretend to take ourselves too seriously, as I sometimes do in the column, you then get found out. And that one thing I think people like about it, and certainly that's meant I've been able to keep it going, is I always make sure the joke is on me rather than on anybody else. You know, I don't think I'm making a fool out of anybody of the people I'm writing about other than myself, you know, and I think readers respond to that, because an awful lot of those sorts of columns, and one of the reasons that sometimes people get upset with journalists is that some of my colleagues sometimes make fun out of people other than themselves, you know, and I don't do that. It's always on me, and I think people seem to like that. And also, I've just, you know, there's a saying in the acting world: never quit a hit. You know, if you're in I don't know, if you're in Killing Eve, or, you know, if you're in Downton Abbey, don't say after season 2, I'm off because I'm going to do something else, or something more important, or something more serious or arty or whatever. Keep going, you know, and that's what I've done. I haven't had the fact that it's sort of middle brow. It's not. I don't think it's low brow, but obviously it's not highbrow. And I'm comfortable with that, and that's why I've sort of been happy to keep it going in that way.
It's interesting how you say you've been on a journey writing the column for over 20 years, and you say how your children have grown up, and that kind of moves nicely to my next question, which is also a journey for you. And you became particularly interested in public speaking, and in 2008 you used the column to gain further practice. What made you decide to do that, and can you tell us about your experiences of the places and people you've spoken to?
Why I did it was, I think we all have sort of fantasies about self-improvement. We all think, wouldn't it be great if we could be a better I don't know, I just, for myself, I'd like to be a better chess player. I'd like to lose weight. I'd like to be able to speak French fluently. And of course, most of these things never come to anything, because life intervenes and you bumble along. But one thing I'd always wanted was to be a better public speaker. It sort of offended me that I was good with words, with the written word, and I was good with the spoken word in terms of having a conversation like this, or a few people. But I was very bad with the spoken word in a public setting, a more formal setting of where there was more than about half a dozen people in the room. And unusually for me, and probably unusually for most people, I decided to do something about it, because normally these sort of fantasies of self-improvement, or, you know, I'm going to get a black belt in karate, do you know what I mean? Nothing ever comes of them. It's just pub talk. But with this, I thought I could see it through, and then I got this amazing response. So then that kind of forced me to do something. I mean, and of those 400 responses, I think I ended up only giving about 40 talks, but that was quite a lot. And I think to begin with, I did a lot of schools to begin with, and because friends were teachers and say, "Oh, can you come and do our prize giving or whatever?" And that was a really tough gig because kids are. I mean, first of all, they're forced to be there. They don't necessarily want to. They're not there by choice. And also, even though I was sort of desperately trawling around for lots of youthful references, in talking about Oasis or Kate Winslet or whatever, even as time passes, your average 16-year-old in 2008, Oasis wasn't cool. It was a pretty dim memory. Do you know what I mean? Or Titanic was a pretty, I'm thinking this is kind of cutting edge youth popular culture. And then you think, oh, actually it's not, because these people were barely born when let alone that's Oasis, let alone kind of Paul Weller or Paul McCartney or Chrissy Hind or somebody, So there it's a tough gig. When it's a more older audience, especially when it's people around my age, and you can throw Bruce Springsteen or Paul McCartney or Prince or various actors and actresses or Alex Ferguson or Andy Murray or Johnny Wilkinson, you can throw these names into the conversation and tell stories about them, then you're home dry, really. And what I noticed was a lot of people, they asked me along under the pretense of sort of talking about the state of journalism. But when it comes to it, all people want to hear is gossip about celebrities, So you go along to a Rotary Club or even in the church sermon. The church was the best because I was standing there in this church in Cheshire, in the pulpit, giving what I thought was a sort of fairly, not kind of heavy, but a fairly sort of a very kind of timesy broadsheet view of, what it is to be a journalist and the nature of the free press and all this stuff. And when I stopped, everyone sort of nodded politely. And then one guy at the back stood up and he said, tell me, when you met Helen Mirren, did you fancy her? Because I bloody well do.
Brilliant.
And I said, mate, we're in church. You can't say things like that in church. But of course he didn't. And so in a way, even with that audience, a sort of middle-aged, middle-class audience, all the serious stuff didn't really matter. It's like it's the same with a column. I mean, I once wrote you mentioned Tony Blair in your intro. I went on Blair's farewell tour in 2007. Well, it was called his farewell tour. And I met Sarkozy, I met Mandela, I met Colonel Gaddafi, we went to Sierra Leone, we went to Iraq, went to France, went to South Africa, I went to Libya, wrote 7,000 words about it, didn't get a single response from a reader. I can write a column about my cats. My inbox is groaning with people who either saying how, most of them saying, oh, that's lovely, I've got, sending me pictures of their cats, or really taking violent issue with something I've written about dogs, So even though we're supposed to be this very highbrow, serious newspaper, when it comes to it, people have everyday life. And again, going back to beta male, I guess this is partly why it succeeds, because it's about, it's about turning the minutiae of everyday life into entertainment and then hoping that it's striking some sort of wider chord, whereas and what I'm not doing in that column is, trying to talk about the state of the nation, because I think there's plenty of that in the newspaper. That people find it elsewhere in the newspaper. My job is principally to entertain people. And the public speaking was a bit like that. But I regard it as one of the sort of success stories, really, because I don't think I got brilliant at it, but I got better at it, and I got sort of serviceable at it, to the extent now, as occasionally still happens, I get asked to do a speech or either by a friend or by somebody, a reader, and it sort of falls into place that I can do it. I don't wildly stress about it. I can do it,
Shortly, Robert, we come on to the final set of questions that we ask all your take guests. They're quick fire questions, but Before we get to that moment, you've spoken about celebrity. You've discussed some of the people you've met and written about over the course of your journalistic career. And I come on to interviewing, and you've interviewed a whole host of celebrities, some of which you've mentioned in the last hour in the public eye, people like Tony Blair, David Cameron, Paul McCartney, Kate Winslet, and Alex Ferguson, and many, many more. What for you makes a good interviewer? And from all the people you've interviewed, who have you found the most interesting? And have there been any disappointing experiences?
No, I don't say I've been disappointed. There've been a couple of sort of absolute disasters, which are not necessarily particularly disappointing because it gives you something to write about. Whereas with the American actress Andie MacDowell, who was from Four Weddings and a Funeral, that went very badly. I think partly because there's a clash between American stars and the British press. They don't get asked the same questions in America as they do here, so they regard some of our questions as intrusive. And also, it was at the end of a very long day. So, to be fair to her, she'd probably been asked the same questions 8 times, but she was sort of fairly dismissive. And if the discussion doesn't turn into a conversation, if it is just question and answer, and if you ask somebody a question and they just say yes or no, then you are struggling over, as you know yourself, you're struggling over the course of an hour to make that work. Disappoint some people. No, I mean, most people aren't disappointing because you're always going to get something, trying to get something out of them. They're disappointing when they don't say anything, either one way or the other. You just want, because that's from a professional disappointment rather than a personal disappointment level. You just want people to say interesting things. I really liked Alex Ferguson was a really good interview because he was incredibly indiscreet about certain aspects of life at Manchester United, and it won me an award, which was great. And I think I got him on a good day. We got on. He was at home, which made a big difference, and he just spoke very candidly. Probably the nicest everybody loves it when I say this, especially when you say this to a British audience and they say, "Who's the nicest person you've interviewed?" And the answer, truthfully, is to David Attenborough. And when you say that to a British audience, it's always this wonderful sigh of relief because he is the most popular man in the country, and everyone just goes, "Oh, thank goodness for that." So David's a nice man, and he is. He's just lovely. Yeah. Again, I interviewed him at his house, but generally speaking, I think it's like people you meet in life. A few of them you're going to really like, a few of them you're really going to dislike, and most people are somewhere in the middle. You know, what makes a good interviewer? Just you've got to find common ground. You've got to try and turn it into a conversation. You've got to obviously ask any difficult questions towards the end rather than the beginning. And a lot of it is about timing. I mean, it's great interviewing people toward the beginning of their career when Jamie Oliver's a good example. I interviewed Jamie Oliver when he was just becoming well known. He was on Channel 4, but he was full of beans. He was optimistic. All those qualities that made him famous were evident in his one-to-one personally. He was just a fun, energetic young guy to be around. And then I interviewed him a few years later when he was properly famous. You know, he was like massive. And although he was still a nice guy, he was a bit guarded and a little bit trying to be a little bit controlling, maybe, as about some of the content and some of the questions. And I guess now, if I interviewed him again, he'd probably be really good again because now he probably doesn't care because and that's what I was going to say. So if you can get somebody at the beginning of their career, like I interviewed Kate Winslet pre-Titanic, or right at the end of their career, like say Rod Stewart, who I interviewed when he was, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, so he was already 70 odd. And Rod Stewart doesn't care what I write about him. Well, he couldn't give a flying one. He's Rod Stewart, and it's not going to affect whether a load of middle-aged women buy his Christmas album. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So he doesn't care anymore. And then, so therefore, he was a great interview because he was funny and frank and self-deprecating and all of those things that you want. But when you interview somebody who's sort of who has made it and is maybe starting to get surrounded by agents and PR people and getting worried about giving offence or getting worried about what something they're going to say is going to be twisted by the Daily Mail, then it becomes problematic because they're suspicious of you and they're anxious about you, and the people around them are anxious about you. Yeah.
Robert, one final question, and then we move on, as I mentioned earlier, to the last 13 quickfire questions to wrap up this evening's interview. And outside of your working life, can I ask you what are your hobbies and interests? And can you tell us what life is like living in Hackney with your wife, Nicola, and your two children?
Yeah.
And do your children have any aspirations, or do they work as journalists themselves? And
No.
What is their perception of your career?
Well, they joke about it. They take the piss out of me because, as is all completely right and proper, they just endlessly make fun of me. No, they don't. My daughter's a civil servant and my son is a care worker, so they don't have aspirations to be journalists. My son still lives at home. My daughter lives next door, so we're a very close family. I watched the football with my son today. My daughter and my wife were doing something else. I mean, what I do outside of work is it's family principally. I mean, we see a lot of my mum, my brothers, my wife's family. My brother-in-law was around this morning. I do a lot of swimming. I go to the gym. I read an awful lot. Potter around Hackney. It's a really nice place. Asking about Hackney, it was a bit of a dump when we first moved here. We lived here 27 years, but now it's really nice. Know a lot of people here because we've been here so long. I've got a lot of younger friends because it's a very youthful, very diverse area. So that's nice, keeps you young, and generally, do what other people do. Go and see friends for the weekend, that kind of stuff. But I spend an awful lot of time reading and writing, even when I'm not having to read and write for work. That is what I like to do. So that would always be my default option. Yeah.
Robert, it's that time. We've asked every single Your Take interviewee these same questions. You don't have to think about these in any detail. They're just quick fire questions to find out things we've maybe not established about yourself in the last hour. So here we go, Robert Crampton. Here they are. Number one. The first one, what is your favorite pastime? You've already kind of answered this one.
My favorite pastime would be reading.
We move from literature now to cinema. What is your favorite film and why?
I'm a big fan of all those old war films that we grew up watching because there was the same films on all the time, but they're a bit slow now. I'm a big Tarantino fan. I think he's a brilliant writer. I'm not sure about I don't worry too much about all the violence and stuff. I just think his scripts are amazing. And they're the ones that I could read. So probably I like them all, but I guess it's probably Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, I'd say that is his
Yeah.
seminal film, his best.
Yeah.
We go back to books again. You mentioned your love of literature. Also, you like to write, of course, and you had aspirations to become a novelist, but who is your favorite novelist?
My favorite novelist, I mean, that would vary all the time. I'm reading an awful lot of I read an awful lot of crime fiction, and it's a guy called Carl Hiaasen, who's a Florida crime thriller writer, but also sort of black humor. I think he's great. Elmore Leonard, who is now sadly died not too long ago, who was the best writer of dialogue I've ever come across. He was a kind of American, again, kind of crime satirical writer. There's a British writer called Mick Herron who's writing sort of satirical spy books at the moment. He's in great form, but it would change all the time. But I tend to read. I'd find somebody and then I would just go through their whole work. I did that recently with Stephen King. I hadn't read any Stephen King because I was put off by the whole kind of spooky stuff. I don't read the spooky stuff. I read his detective stuff. So yeah,
kind of share your thing there. I'm a bit like that with filmmakers. I'll pick up on a specific filmmaker that I like and admire, and then I'll just go through pretty much all their back catalogue and every film they've made.
Yeah.
If you could have had a different profession, what do you think it would have been?
I quite like to have been an actor. I think I could have been a good actor, but then I would have had to say other people's lines, so that would have been a problem. I've thought about the part. I mean, obviously, I tended towards politics when I was younger, but too many meetings, and too much having to sort of say stuff that you don't agree with, or I'd like to have done. If the money was any good, I'd like to have done something just like outdoorsy and simple, like I mean, I look at the guys, the park rangers here, but I mean, I'm sure I couldn't do it because they don't earn enough money, and I'm not trying to romanticize their life, but I think apart from the money, that's not a bad job. Do you know what I mean? Doing something useful out in the outdoors. You can measure what you're doing, making the park nice.
Probably good for your mental health as well, in fairness,
Right.
being out in the fresh air and
And or I wouldn't have minded being an academic because I quite like. I think that's, you can teach people and you can get a lot of time off to do other stuff.
And just quickly on the acting front, who would you cite as a favourite actor or actress?
I think the best actor around of my generation would be Gary Oldman, because he just plays different people. A lot of actors they're great stars, but they're essentially playing the same role. Whereas Oldman, as we know, is capable of, and the same applies to DiCaprio actually as well. So I'm not. There's film stars and then there's actors, and sometimes they're both. And I suppose Leonardo DiCaprio is a film star, but he's also a really great actor. And then Helen Mirren, I guess Helen Mirren, she's great. Yeah,
some great choices. I agree with you on Gary Oldman. I think he's tremendous, highly versatile, and I do like DiCaprio as well.
I like character actors. I like Gene Hackman. I like Robert Duvall. I think they're the people who they really know what they're doing.
Who in life would you say has been your greatest inspiration?
Probably my wife Nicola, because I've known her so long. I've known her since we were 11. We didn't go out when we were that young, but we were friends then. We didn't start going out till we were in our 20s. But Nicola's been, part of the fabric of my life for as long as I can remember. But for Nicola, because I've got certain sort of slightly sort of not lazy, but slightly certain self-destructive streak. I don't think I would have had the career that I have. I would have been one of those guys who's maybe would have complained about not having had the career that I think I ought to have had. And she's kept me on the straight and narrow just about.
Here's the question to ask you. You obviously write for a newspaper, but do you read one? And if so, which one is your one of choice?
Well, obviously my paper of choice is the Times, which I write for. That's no surprise there. I think there have been periods in my time there when it probably, if I'm honest, it probably hasn't been the best newspaper around. I think there have been periods when the Guardian and the Telegraph and the Independent were all better. I don't think that's the case at the moment. I think we're a top product at the moment. But I read. I mean, I don't read every paper every day, but I read chunks of papers. I read quite a lot of the Financial Times. I read quite a lot of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. I read chunks of the Daily Mail and Mail Online because some of that stuff you've got to know about. And I don't know if it counts. I read a lot of The Economist, which is, I know it counts itself as a newspaper. So most people think of it as a magazine, but I read,
What would you say is your favourite food next?
Sorry, I missed that, James. You broke up a bit there.
Yeah, what would you say is your favourite food?
My favourite food, I've got really bland taste in food. I mean, I'm lucky because I like healthy food. I like vegetables and salad, and I like fish and chicken and fruit and all the things that you're supposed to eat that are good for you. I don't really like junk food. So probably if I like maybe sushi. If I had to live on something for the rest of my life, it might be sushi.
Who would you
Although
say?
I've actually heard it's now really bad for you, so maybe not.
Who would you say is your favourite cultural icon if you had to choose just one?
Cultural icon. Let me think.
Could be someone from the world of politics,
Yeah.
maybe an inventor or somebody who's changed the world or shaped it in some way.
Yeah, I mean, my people, I suppose, that I would admire are people who just do things that I could never do in a million years, which would be scientists, people who invented, people who invent. I mean, they're the ones who really make a difference to quality of human life. I can't think of any one single person. I'll kick myself afterwards because there's bound to be a long list. But let me think. I'll go with, well, coming from Hull, there was we had houses named after famous local people, and there's only two of them nobody's really heard of, but there's not that many famous people from Hull. But there were two, and I'll give them, but one was William Wilberforce, who was MP for Hull, who was obviously prime mover in abolishing the slave trade, and the other was Amy Johnson, who was the first woman to fly single-handed from England to Australia in the early days of aviation. And they would cover it, both adventure and glamour and doing the right thing.
Next, we ask you to choose your favourite curse word. What would it be and why?
Funny enough, I was talking with my daughter about this just yesterday, and we spent so long talking about it. I'm a big fan of bollocks. Having a slight northern accent, I don't really have a northern accent anymore, but I still have flat vowels, so bastard is always good, because you can't really say bastard.
That sounded good when you said it then.
Yeah, you've got to say it sound like Sean Bean, basically. You bastard. And there's a great.
I could see the actor thing coming out now. See?
Yeah, there's a great compilation on YouTube of Sean Bean just saying bastard, which I thoroughly recommend. Because he says it in all his roles. So, and you can't really say it with a long vowel. You can't really say it in a southern accent. It sounds stupid. But obviously, fuck is the go-to, and its various variations. It's just quality. The single thing that would improve my column would be, I mean, I'm sure there's lots of ways of improving it, but the single thing that would improve it is if I was allowed to swear. Because there are some gags and some scenarios where you have to swear, And I love swearing. Absolutely adore swearing.
From curse words now, oddly, to travel.
Yes.
When you get a chance to go away, relax, what is your favourite place or holiday destination?
I'm about to go to it, actually. There's two. One is Southwest France, where my parents bought a house 30 years ago, and which I was lucky enough to inherit. So that doesn't do much for my man of the people credentials, but I do have a holiday house in France. And the other is the coast of Pembrokeshire, where we're about to go for in 2 weeks' time, where we've been going for 20 odd years with the same bunch of people to a quite funky hotel on the cliff top in Pembrokeshire. And although at this time of year it's like going from midsummer into sort of mid-autumn because of the Welsh climate, it's still brilliant. I love going there. Yeah.
Robert, who would you say is your favourite music artist, and what would you cite as your favourite album?
My favourite music artist is probably Bruce Springsteen, who I've had the pleasure of interviewing. The Boss. My favourite album would probably be London Calling by The Clash. Although be a few, and this is again is something that I mull over, as we all do, you know, your Desert Island Discs and so on. But pound for pound, partly because it's a double album, I'd go with London Calling.
Likewise, I'm a Springsteen fan and grew up buying and listening to a lot of his early albums. I still think The River is a tremendous
Nebraska
album. Yeah, and this I love Tunnel of Love as well. I'm interested to find out, what was Springsteen like, because I always kind of get the impression that he's somebody who hasn't necessarily been daunted or destroyed by his level of celebrity and fame. He's kind of stayed on the straight and narrow. I know there have been a little bit of, you know,
he had a bit of a wobble.
He had a divorce, didn't he?
He had a wobble, which
late
is what
80s, and drink driving recently.
That's what and that's what that is. The Tunnel of Love is about his divorce, isn't it? In late 80s. But no, he's a top man. And again, it's like, you know, people say you shouldn't meet your heroes, but the ones I've met who are people who are like, again, you know, Sir David Attenborough, and also with Springsteen, he was great. I met him just after 9/11. So we talked about it for The Rising, and so we talked about
very good album as well.
And we talked about that. He was, and like you say, precisely right. He was somebody who was not only been not destroyed by his celebrity, but has used it in the best possible way, I think, and to promote good causes and to produce good music. I mean, I think of all those people that have led that level of stardom and have been around that long, the one who's still producing relevant, listenable music rather than just rehashing is Glory Days. To getting a little Bruce reference there, is Bruce Springsteen, actually. And I think younger bands, the respect he gets from younger bands bears that out, actually, because he's done his folk album, and he's done his and he could have just, after Born in the USA, he could have just kept churning out the stadium rock stuff, and he didn't. He did his sort of country-ish album with Tunnel of Love, and when I was hanging out with Bruce, he was, as you do, he was listening to there's a channel in America called the Black Entertainment Channel, which has got a lot of gospel on it, and he was listening to that and playing some of that, because it's been a big influence on him, you know. So he's cool. Yeah, he's a cool guy.
Yeah, and he's always struck me as somebody who's a thinker who questions, you know, the way of life or why things are a certain way. He seems a very intelligent.
He's intelligent, but I think he also knows that he's in show business and he wants to put on a show, which is why his live shows are so. And he said that to me. He said, you know, when he was quite passionate about it. He said, you sell somebody a ticket, you're making a contract with them. You are making a contract that you are with them, that you are going to entertain them. So if that means playing for 3 hours and doing a sort of few corny kind of rock and roll things like knee slides and all that sort of stuff, or inviting people up on stage and, you know, all that, he's going to do it, because it's a circus. You know, it's a lot of things. He said, he said it's a political meeting, it's a religious meeting, it's a circus, but it's his job to deliver, and he takes it seriously. And I think some of the other people of that stature who've been around for so long are probably just still going through the motions and playing the old hits, you know. And I don't think he is, and yeah, I admire him for that.
The last two now. Firstly, what is your greatest achievement to date?
Oh, that would be my children, undeniably. Absolutely my children, yeah. And they're great, you know, mostly their mother's work, but partly mine.
And lastly, Robert Crampton, we end with this one. How do you wish to be remembered?
I'd like to be remembered as somebody, in terms of my personal life, who was a decent person, who did the right thing, and in my professional life as somebody who entertained people, maybe informed them on occasion, and wasn't rude, wasn't horrible about anything, anybody, unless they deserved it, and introduced a few new facts into the world, which is all you can do as a journalist, you know, a few new insights possibly. But yeah, who never thought he was better or worse than anybody else.
Robert Crampton, that is the end of tonight's Your Take interview. I think we've been talking for around about 80 minutes, and
we've started a bit early. Yeah,
we've covered so many aspects of your life, and I guess fair to say the journey from beginning to where you are now, where we've spoken about your relationship with your wife, meeting at such a young age and getting married, and your 2 adult children now, your political background with particularly your dad's influence. We've spoken about your career, which is predominantly the main focal point of the interview with the Times and all that you've achieved. But thanks a lot it's been a fascinating insight.
Oh, good. It's my pleasure, James. Thank you for inviting me. I hope other people enjoy it too.
Lastly, you're always a little bit nervous when you're interviewing a professional journalist who's interviewed the creme de la creme, and you're an amateur in comparison. But thanks for joining me this evening. And how do we find out more about your work? And
well, you buy the Times.
Obviously, yeah. That's a silly question, wouldn't it?
Or more, we encourage people to go online, but there is a paywall, so there's a subscription, very reasonable, but you have to pay. It's not free. I did do a book of collected columns a few years ago, but I suspect that's out of print. It sold very poorly indeed, and because I think people who were fans were thinking, why would I pay to buy something that I'd already read for nothing? So I don't think that might not be available. But yeah, read my stuff in the Times. Yeah, every Tuesday, every Saturday, and points in between.
And to end, is there any plans to write a book or do any other written projects outside of the newspaper?
I've always got plans, I think. But I'm busy, and like I say, my concentration span isn't what it ought to be in terms of book writing. My daughter and I are thinking of doing a podcast at the moment, so maybe that's the way forward, or just banging something online. The idea of sort of grinding through with a publishing deal, I think that's kind of gone really. I think I might just put something out there and see what happens. I mean,
we watch this space for a potential podcast.
Yeah,
with your daughter. And to end again, thank
you. We want to call it Straight Outta Crampton.
That's a very good title. That's brilliant. Yeah, aptly title. That's brilliant. Yeah,
it's not bad, is it? It's not bad.
It's very, very good. Very good play on words.
Thank you.
Thanks again for your time, and all the very best with all your future endeavours.
Okay. Thanks a lot, James. Same to you. Nice talking to you.
Thank you.
Take it easy.